Kale had always believed that dying in space would at least feel poetic, something about silence and distant starlight giving it a certain dignity. But as the warning sirens screamed for the seventh time in less than a minute, and the cockpit filled with the sharp smell of overheated circuits, he was forced to admit that it mostly felt inconvenient. He smacked the side of the console, as if the ship might respond to emotional encouragement, which it did not, and glanced out at the formation of Imperial warships, closing in with the calm certainty of predators who had already decided how the story would end. "I'd like to formally apologize," he muttered, though whether it was to the ship or himself remained unclear, for every bad decision that led to this one. Behind him, something large shifted, scales scraping faintly against the metal walls in a way that suggested the walls were losing the argument. The dragon, coiled in a space that was objectively too small for it, yet somehow still insufficiently comfortable, exhaled a thin stream of heat that warped the air. "Your apology is noted," it said, its voice echoing directly inside Kale's head with the particular tone of someone who had expected better and was not surprised to be disappointed. "It will not improve our odds." "Oh, good," Kale replied, yanking a lever that absolutely should not have come loose in his hand. "I was worried optimism might ruin the mood." Outside, the first volley of plasma fire lit up the void, streaks of burning energy cutting toward them with relentless precision. Kale twisted the controls, the ship responding with a shudder that felt less like a maneuver and more like a protest. The blast skimmed past them, close enough that the hull rang like a bell struck by an angry god. The dragon lifted its head slightly, unimpressed. "You fly like someone who learned from instructions written by an enemy." "I did," Kale snapped. "They're very detailed." Another barrage followed, tighter this time, and Kale felt the inevitability of it settle in his chest. There was no clever escape, no hidden advantage waiting to reveal itself, just distance closing, systems failing, and a future that was rapidly shrinking into a single, unpleasant moment. He exhaled slowly, fingers tightening on the controls as if that alone could hold reality together. "Well," he said, almost conversationally, "it's been a very educational experience." "Educational," the dragon repeated, as if tasting the word and finding it lacking. The next shot should have ended it. Kale saw it coming, a brilliant line of light that seemed to erase everything around it, and for a brief second, the universe narrowed into that single point. Then something went wrong. Not with the weapon, but with everything else. The light bent, subtly at first, then decisively, curving away from the ship as though it had reconsidered its purpose. Time did not stop exactly, but it hesitated, stretching thin enough that Kale could feel it, like a breath held too long. There was someone standing in the cockpit. Kale did not remember the door opening, mostly because there was no door to open, and yet she was there, positioned between one moment and the next with a kind of quiet certainty that made the chaos outside feel distant. She looked human, almost reassuringly so, until his gaze caught the long, elegant curve of her ears, extending past her hair in a way that did not belong to anything he understood. Her eyes moved to the viewport, watching the distorted path of the blast with mild curiosity. "That was going to be unpleasant," she said. Kale blinked, once, then again, because that seemed like the appropriate response to impossible things. "You think?" The dragon shifted, its attention sharpening in a way Kale had never felt before. "You are not part of this sequence," it said, its voice lower now, edged with something that might have been caution. She smiled slightly, as if the statement amused her. "Not originally." Another volley approached, but slower now, or perhaps everything else was simply moving differently around her. She stepped forward, and the space she moved through seemed to adjust, aligning itself with her presence rather than the other way around. The incoming fire unraveled, beams splitting into harmless fragments that scattered like forgotten thoughts. Kale stared, then let out a short, incredulous laugh. "I'm either saved or hallucinating." "Both are possible," she replied. "That's not comforting." "It wasn't meant to be." The dragon let out a quiet, rumbling sound that might have been approval or the beginning of a complaint. Kale, still gripping controls that no longer seemed relevant, looked from the warships outside to the woman who had just disagreed with reality and won. "So," he said carefully, "is there a reason you're helping me, or should I just assume I've become interesting enough to keep alive?" Her gaze shifted to him, thoughtful, as if measuring something he couldn't see. "You don't survive in most outcomes," she said. "I found that inefficient." Kale considered this, then nodded slowly. Right, of course, efficiency, that makes perfect sense. The dragon snorted, a flicker of heat curling through the air. Your life has become a revision. Kale leaned back slightly, watching as the Empire's formation faltered, their precise movements dissolving into confusion. Well, he said, a crooked smile forming despite everything, I hope the editor plans to stick around. The Empire did not retreat so much as pause, which Kale quickly realized was worse, because anything powerful enough to hesitate mid-attack was usually deciding how to make the next one more personal. The warships held their formation at a cautious distance, their weapons dimming but not disengaging, like predators pretending they weren't still very interested in eating him. Kale loosened his grip on the controls just enough to feel the ache in his fingers and glanced sideways at the woman who had casually redirected annihilation, as if she were rearranging furniture. So, he said, clearing his throat in a way that suggested he had no idea how to begin this conversation. When you said I don't survive in most outcomes, are we talking slightly worse odds or statistically insulting? She tilted her head, considering. There are versions where you last longer. That's not the reassurance you think it is. Behind him, the dragon shifted again, its presence filling the cramped ship with quiet authority. You speak as though survival is a matter of chance, it said, its voice threading through Kale's thoughts with a low, deliberate weight. It is a matter of capability. Kale gestured vaguely toward the viewport, where an entire Imperial fleet was currently recalculating its approach. I feel like we're past the point where personal growth solves this. The woman stepped closer to the console, her fingers hovering just above the flickering interface without touching it. The screen stabilized anyway, the chaotic warnings smoothing into neat, readable lines. They're adjusting, she said. They don't understand what happened, but they will try to make it impossible for it to happen again. Kale let out a short laugh. That's comforting. I love an enemy that learns. They always do, she replied almost gently. That's why they last. The dragon made a quiet sound that might have been agreement. And why they fall, it added. For a moment, the three of them existed in a fragile stillness, suspended between attacks, between decisions, between whatever came next. Kale became acutely aware of how strange this was, not the imminent danger, which felt almost routine now, but the fact that he was standing in a failing ship with a reality-bending stranger and an ancient dragon discussing strategy like this was a mildly inconvenient meeting. He exhaled slowly. All right, he said, more to himself than anyone else. New plan, we stop running. The dragon's amusement flickered through the link between them. You have not been running well. Exactly, Kale shot back. So we try something new. The woman's gaze shifted to him, sharper now, as if his words had aligned with something she had already seen. You want to engage them directly. I want them to stop thinking I'm prey, Kale said, or at least make them regret the assumption. That will end badly, she said. It usually does, he admitted, but apparently I've got an advantage now. He gestured toward her, then hesitated, which, by the way, still needs explaining, preferably before I base my entire survival strategy on it. She was quiet for a moment, her expression distant in a way that suggested she was listening to something far beyond the ship. When she spoke, her voice was softer, but no less certain. I don't change everything, she said. Only the parts that lead to outcomes I won't accept. Kale raised an eyebrow. That sounds very selective. It has to be, she replied. Too much and nothing holds. The dragon let out a low rumble. You interfere with the structure of events, it said. You choose which versions persist. She nodded slightly. Kale stared at her, then glanced back at the fleet, then back at her again. So what you're saying is, he said slowly, I've been dying repeatedly, and you've just been editing out the inconvenient ones. That's one way to describe it. He let that sit for a second, then shook his head with a faint, incredulous smile. I knew my life felt inconsistent. A new signal flared across the console, sharper than the others, carrying a precision that made Kale's instincts tighten immediately. The Empire had finished recalculating. The warships shifted, their formation tightening into something more deliberate, more controlled. A faint distortion spread through space around them, subtle but unmistakable. The woman's expression changed, the calm giving way to focus. They're stabilizing the field, she said. They're trying to limit variance. Kale blinked. Variance, he repeated. That's me now, I'm variance. Uncontrolled, she added. Of course I am. The dragon's presence grew heavier, its attention locking onto the shifting pattern outside. They are adapting to you, it said to her, not to him. Kale frowned. I feel slightly insulted by that. You should, the dragon replied. The distortion intensified, the space around the ship tightening in a way that made Kale's skin prickle. For the first time since she had appeared, the woman did not move immediately. There was a delay, small but noticeable, like a hesitation she hadn't had before. Kale saw it and something in his chest tightened. That's new, he said quietly. Yes, she replied. The next wave of fire came not as a scattered barrage, but as a precise, synchronized strike, cutting through space with unnerving clarity. Kale's hands moved instinctively, pulling the ship into motion, but he knew it wouldn't be enough. Not this time. The woman stepped forward, but the air around her resisted, reality holding its shape with stubborn insistence. For a fraction of a second, nothing changed. Kale laughed under his breath, not because it was funny, but because it felt like the only appropriate response. Okay, he said, gripping the controls tighter. Now it's getting interesting. The dragon's voice curled through his thoughts, steady and fierce. Now, it said, it becomes a fight. The first impact should have erased them. Kale saw it clearly this time, not as a distant inevitability, but as a precise calculation closing in from all sides, the Empire's synchronized fire carving a perfect end into space. The ship shuddered, alarms collapsing into a single continuous scream, and for a brief, unhelpful moment, Kale considered that he might finally achieve that poetic death he had once imagined, though now it seemed less poetic and more aggressively inconvenient. Except it didn't happen. Not cleanly, not decisively. The blast struck, but reality bent just enough to let it glance away, scraping past them like a missed accusation. The woman staggered slightly, her hand tightening in empty air as if she were holding something invisible together. Kale noticed it immediately, the effort, the strain that hadn't been there before. You're losing your touch, he said, half a joke, half a concern he didn't quite want to name. I'm being limited, she replied, her voice thinner now, stretched between moments. The dragon rose behind him, unfolding with a slow, deliberate power that made the small ship feel irrelevant. Then we stop relying on her, it said. We fight as we were meant to. Kale exhaled, a sharp breath that carried more resolve than fear this time. Something had shifted in him, not suddenly, but steadily, across every narrow escape and impossible survival. He wasn't just the man being saved anymore. Yeah, he said, a crooked smile forming despite everything. About time I contributed. He pushed the controls forward, not to evade, but to advance. The ship lurched toward the Imperial formation, engines protesting loudly, as if offended by the sudden change in philosophy. The dragon's presence surged through him, a fierce, ancient clarity flooding his thoughts, aligning instinct with action. For once, Kale didn't hesitate. The Empire responded instantly, their formation tightening, their weapons recalibrating to meet the unexpected approach. The distortion field pulsed, trying to anchor everything into predictable outcomes. But Kale was no longer trying to be predictable. He dove straight into the formation, weaving through the narrowing gaps with a precision that would have surprised his earlier self, if that version had survived long enough to see it. The dragon unleashed a torrent of fire that burned not just through metal, but through the very equations holding the ships together, its flames tearing open brief fractures in the Empire's perfect logic. Left, Kale shouted. I am aware of left, the dragon replied, though it adjusted anyway. Behind them, the woman moved again, slower now, more deliberate. She didn't try to rewrite everything. Instead, she chose moments, small, critical shifts. A weapon firing a fraction too late. A trajectory bending just enough to miss. Not perfection, but possibility. Kale began to understand. She wasn't carrying him anymore. She was giving him room to exist. Okay, he said, almost laughing as another near miss scorched past the hull. This feels slightly more fair. Still terrible, but fair. The dragon's amusement flickered. You improve. Don't get used to it. At the center of the formation, the largest ship loomed, its structure pulsing with the energy of the stabilizing field. Kale knew, without needing to be told, that this was the anchor, the point where the Empire held reality in place. End it there, the woman said quietly. Kale nodded. Yeah, no pressure. He pushed the ship harder than it had any right to go, the engines screaming in protest as they closed the distance. The Empire focused everything on that final approach, their fire converging into a single, unavoidable line. For a moment, it looked exactly like all the endings she had erased. But this time, Kale didn't wait for her to change it. He adjusted his course at the last possible instant, a move that felt less like calculation and more like trust. Trust in the dragon, in her, and in the version of himself that had learned how to survive without being rewritten. The dragon surged forward, breaking free of the ship in a blaze of impossible motion, its fire striking the core of the Imperial vessel. The impact wasn't immediate destruction, but something deeper, a disruption, a fracture in the carefully maintained order. The stabilizing field collapsed. Reality exhaled. The remaining ships faltered, their precision dissolving into confusion, then into retreat. Not a dramatic defeat, but an unraveling, quiet and irreversible. Silence followed, vast and unfamiliar. Kale slumped back in his seat, staring out at the emptying space, his pulse slowly returning to something resembling normal. "Well," he said after a moment, "that went better than expected." The dragon settled beside him, its presence calmer now. "You did not die," it said. "This is an improvement. I aim to keep that trend going." He turned to the woman. She stood a little unsteadily, but she was still there, her form no longer flickering, her expression softer than before. Not distant now, but present. "So," Kale said, studying her, "what happens when you stop rewriting things?" She met his gaze, a faint smile forming. "Then we see what you do on your own." He considered that, then nodded slowly. "That's mildly terrifying." "It should be." Kale leaned back, letting out a quiet breath, a different kind this time. Not relief exactly, but something steadier. He wasn't just the man who survived because someone refused to let him die. He was the man who had learned how to live inside the chaos, with or without the edits. He glanced at the two of them, the dragon and the woman who had bent reality itself, and smiled slightly. "Well," he said, "if this is the version that sticks, I think I can work with it." The silence after the Empire's retreat did not feel like victory at first. It felt suspicious, like the universe was waiting for someone to correct a mistake. Kale sat in the dim cockpit, staring at systems that had finally stopped screaming, and found himself tapping the console just to make sure something would break again out of habit. Nothing did. It was deeply unsettling. "Well," he said, leaning back, "either we won, or this is the part where something worse arrives fashionably late." "Your optimism remains misplaced," the dragon replied, though its tone lacked the usual bite. It had coiled itself more loosely now, as if the absence of immediate danger had forced it into an unfamiliar state called patience. Lyra stood near the viewport, quieter than before, watching the scattered remnants of the fleet dissolve into distant points of light. Her presence no longer bent the space around her so sharply. The edges of things stayed where they were supposed to be. Kale noticed that too. "You're not doing it anymore," he said. "I could," she answered, without turning. "But I don't need to." "That's new," he said. "I've grown accustomed to reality being optional." "It was never optional," she replied softly. "Only negotiable." Kale let that sit, then nodded to himself. "Fair. I suppose I should try living in it properly for once." The dragon shifted, its gaze moving between them. "You intend to stop altering outcomes," it said to Lyra. "I intend to stop deciding them alone." Kale raised an eyebrow. "That sounds suspiciously like trust." "It is," she said. He laughed under his breath. "Dangerous concept. I usually avoid it right after large-scale interstellar conflicts." The ship drifted for a while, no one rushing to fill the quiet. For once, Kale didn't feel the need to escape it. The constant edge of survival had dulled into something steadier, something he could actually stand on. He realized, with mild surprise, that he wasn't waiting for the next disaster. Not because it wouldn't come, but because he no longer expected to face it the same way. "So what now?" he asked eventually. "We defeated a galactic empire, annoyed the laws of existence, and somehow I'm still alive. Feels like there should be a follow-up plan." The dragon gave a low, thoughtful rumble. "There are always more empires," it said. "More wars, more beings who believe they control what cannot be controlled." Kale sighed. "I was hoping for a vacation." "You would complain about it," the dragon said. "That's not the point." Lyra turned from the viewport then, her expression lighter than it had ever been. Not distant, not burdened by unseen outcomes, but present in a way that made her seem almost ordinary. If one ignored the long, elegant curve of her ears, and the fact that she had once rewritten entire sequences of reality like notes in a margin. "There will be other conflicts," she said, but they won't all be yours. Kale looked at her carefully. And you, no more edits. She shook her head slightly. Not unless I have to. He smiled faintly. Good. I'd like to at least pretend my decisions matter. They do, she said. They always did. For a moment, he didn't answer. Then he stood, stretching slightly, as if testing a version of himself that no longer needed to brace for impact every second. All right, he said. New plan. We go somewhere that isn't trying to kill us. The dragon made a quiet sound of approval. An acceptable strategy. Kale moved to the controls, the ship responding more smoothly now, as if it too had decided to cooperate for once. He set a course without overthinking it, something distant and unclaimed, a place where the future wasn't already written or rewritten. As the engines engaged, he glanced back at Lyra. You know, he said, for someone who can bend reality, you picked a very strange way to spend your time. She tilted her head. How so? Saving me, he said simply. She smiled just a little. You made it interesting. He shook his head, amused. I'll try to keep doing that. Preferably without almost dying every 5 minutes. No promises, the dragon added. Of course not. The ship slipped into the dark between stars, not fleeing this time, not chased, but moving forward by choice. Kale felt the difference in that, subtle but undeniable. He wasn't a man surviving borrowed outcomes anymore. He was someone who had seen the edges of his own endings and decided, stubbornly, to keep going anyway. And for once, the universe didn't